And our speaker this morning is well known to DSA. He is our treasurer also and keeps track of our funds. J.D. Mitchell is a retired registered professional engineer. He has a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Washington. He has also completed his Master of Biblical Studies in Biblical Creation Apologetics from Master's Graduate School of Divinity. J.D. was Executive Director of the Institute for Creation Science that met monthly Sunday evenings, one Sunday evening a month in Portland from 2005 through 2018. He does creation science research, writes, and speaks regarding the creation versus evolution controversy as a part of his creation science ministry, which is Creation Engineering Concepts. JD is a member of DSA and also the Creation Research Society. His free monthly email newsletter, CEC News, is designed to keep subscribers up to date on the latest news and articles regarding Biblical Creation Apologetics and his ministry, JD's ministry. His wife, Bonnie, assists him in his ministry, and they have a table in the back with some fossils on display and some for sale. So, JD, thank you. Looking forward to this.
Well, thank you, Mark, and good morning, everyone. All right, so the topic today is evolution's 14 greatest frauds. Last month, right here at this very location, Milt Marcy explained that from the evil hearts and minds of two men especially, the biblical history of thousands of years was replaced by millions of years in uniformitarianism. And this idea was accepted by many within the church and outside the church and has held sway in the Western culture for over 200 years now. I want to remind you who we're talking about. We're talking about these two men, James Hutton on the left, and that's how long when he lived, and then there's Charles Lyell on the right. Now, it's my opinion that without the writings of these two men and the others who followed their leading, the idea of millions of years would never have come into play. And if that didn't happen, if there was no millions of years, then it'd be awfully difficult for anyone to imagine, scientifically anyway, any sort of evolution. Now here's a dictionary definition for fraud. Fraud is deceit, trickery, intentional deception. Now how did I choose these 14 greatest evolutionary frauds? Well, I chose those that I believe have had or are now having the most negative impact on the advancement of science, as well as doing the greatest harm to the Christian faith. So I will go through the 14 frauds that I picked, and then we'll come back, and in the same order we will go through each one with more specific information. First one's a Big Bang, the Miller-Urey experiment, the Thebes Haeckelii, Haeckel's embryos. Number 5 is transitional fossils in the rock record. Number 6 is Archaeopteryx. Number 7 is Hesperopithecus, also known as Nebraska man. Number 8 is the horse series that we get to. Number 9 is ape to man progression. Number 10 is Piltdown man. 11 is a peppered moth. Then we have Archaeoraptor. And the final two are the Himalayan fossil fraud and natural selection. So it's important for us to know, if we're talking about frauds and talking about science, just what is science? Well, science is a process for acquiring knowledge about the universe and everything that's in it. And the process is generally guided by the use of the scientific method. So if we're going to say that we're going to use in our science, we're going to use the scientific method, we need to know what the scientific method is. The essence of the scientific method is measurement, observation, repeatability, and falsifiability. And any viable hypothesis must be testable and capable of being refuted. Well, what we find goes on in today and throughout history really is that, at least modern history, is that science gets mixed up with history. So we need to know what history is. History is a record of past events, an account of what has happened, especially past events, a known or recorded past. That's a dictionary definition for history. So let's consider the fraud of evolution, and so we're going to look at Big Bang first. It's the most popular secular explanation for the origin of the universe, and its purpose, of course, is to replace the biblical account. It was a supposed random chance event 12 to 20 billion years ago, and proposed as a replacement for the creation story that's in the Bible. It's also supposed to be an explanation for the origin of everything without a need for, what happened to my PowerPoint? There it is, back again. Okay, so why is it a fraud? It's a fraud because it's promoted as a scientific explanation for the replacement of God. It's not scientific in the sense that the scientific method cannot be applied to it. It's an assumed historical event. So it you can't, just like we can't have the creation, God isn't going to create everything all over for us again. Well, the Big Bang is not, there's no way we can do any sort of hypothesis with regard to it. It's all just an assumed historical event. So here's just one example of a component of this just so story, and there are many other similar examples that could be used. For one example, the Big Bang theory currently requires the universe to be composed of over 1/4 of what is called dark matter, but no one has ever seen or sampled dark matter. No one even knows where to look for it. From the standpoint of science, I think this quote explains the Big Bang very accurately. When I study astronomy, I have a big difficulty with studying astronomy because what I find is a lot of the astronomy today is not astronomy, it's cosmology. And cosmology is unique in science in that it is a very large intellectual edifice based on very few facts. And that's evolutionist who made that quote. I think that quote explains the Big Bang very accurately. Let's talk a little bit about the Big Bang and the James Webb Telescope, which was launched in 2021, with the purpose to look at the outer reaches of the universe. Here are just some things they've found out so far. They found large spiral galaxies, they found massive black holes, and they found that no stars have just light elements in them like hydrogen and helium. So these findings just by themselves scientifically refute the Big Bang theories that exist today. Because according to the Big Bang, when we get way out to the edges of the universe, we should see the way things were at the very beginning. And their theory would be, well, we should be seeing galaxies forming. Well, what they're seeing is fully formed large spiral galaxies out there. They're finding everything out there the way that not the way that the Big Bang theory would expect it to be. So when considering the Big Bang versus the biblical explanation for the beginning of things, I think that we are looking at an argument more over history than over science. And this is because the Big Bang is simply a collection of atheistic philosophical ideas concocted to explain history without God. And here's a summary of what the Bible says. Let's remind ourselves what God tells us about the beginning of everything. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. in Exodus 20:11a, for in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the hosts of them by the breath of his mouth, Psalm 33:6. So that, just as a background, let's keep that in mind when we're considering the Big Bang. And now let's look at some historical comparisons. If we're going to say we believe our history has advantage over the history of the secularists, well, just what are these differences? So we look up here and we've got these comparisons. We got the Big Bang in this column, we got God's Word in this column. Now if we look at the first cause of the Big Bang is nothing. There was nothing and then there was everything. According to God's Word, the first cause was God. We look at the authority for the idea. The authority comes from men for the Big Bang. The authority for the God's Word, of course, comes directly from God. We look at the Big Bang and who was witness? Well, no one witnessed the Big Bang. No one was there to say, yeah, that's the way it happened. It happened just the way that our theory says. But of course, we know that God was there, and he talks about as a witness of the creation according to his explanation in the Bible. And so as a person, each one of us, what kind of faith do we have to have? Well, we have to have faith in naturalism if we're going to accept the Big Bang. We have to have faith in God, which matches up to every aspect of our faith. Now let's look at historical comparison B. How do these compare so far as they are? There are a lot of things that match up with them. Well, and the Big Bang, according to the Big Bang, this happened 12 to 20 billion years ago. According to God's Word, the creation happened 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. Big difference there. Let's look at the summary statement. The Big Bang summary, everything from nothing. The summary of creation, everything from the Creator God. Common sense likelihood. Well, if you just use your common sense and you look at the Big Bang theory, you see there really is no common sense to it. Whereas if you have a faith in God's Word, well, there would be a high likelihood of the explanation. And so our judgment would be the Big Bang is fraudulent and God's Word is true. So the Big Bang is not only questionable science, but it is a proposed theory with no historian. If the Bible it's proposed history, but there's no historian. If the Bible is God's true word, then the Big Bang is a fraudulent philosophical or religious statement. Let me conclude this discussion about the Big Bang with this. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. And that's Psalm 19, 1 through 4. So let's move next to evolution fraud number 2, which is the Miller-Urey experiment. Many of you probably have heard of it. I'll give you a little background. In 1953, Stanley Miller, a graduate student of Nobel Prize in Chemistry winner Harold Urey, published the results of a laboratory experiment. At that time, Miller titled the report of his work as A Production of Amino Acids Under Possible Primitive Earth Conditions, and then another paper was Production of Some Organic Compounds Under Possible Primitive Earth Conditions. This is the image of a page in the high school textbook. The name of the book is Biology Visualizing Life by Holt. And so the reason I took this image out of a high school biology book is because I want you to know that they are still putting this experiment in current high school biology textbooks to say what we'll be talking about, that this proves life can come from chemicals. Now, here's a conclusive quote from that whole textbook. Here's what they say. Quote, "These experiments show that the components of the macromolecules found in living things could have formed spontaneously on the early Earth." And other high school textbooks say the same thing. While this statement may be in some sense technically true, the insinuation is, and when you look at what they're trying to tell the kids, the insinuation is that life can come from non-life, which is against the law of biogenesis. And let me remind you what the law of biogenesis is. The law of biogenesis says life only comes from life and cells only come from cells, and it is a law of nature that has never been observed to fail. Now here's a similar diagram of the experiment from the creationist book, Evolutionist Achilles' Heel. And so what we have here is we have boiling water here that drives this experiment, and so it drives the experiment around this direction, and then the result of the experiment is trapped right here. And what we have up here are various gases, methane, hydrogen, and water, and so forth. But what you got to notice is they don't have any oxygen. Their oxygen is not allowed to be in there, because if oxygen had been in there, it would have destroyed the whole experiment. They wouldn't have gotten anything out of there because of how aggressive oxygen combines with other things. And then they got 60,000 volts of electricity they shoot into this container. And then they got a condenser here that condenses all this, and it drips down. And when they get done, they have a toxic red stain in that trap. So the gases up there were methane, ammonia, and hydrogen. No oxidizing gases, though. 60,000 volt sparking device, as I mentioned. And after a few days, they found this toxic red stain. So consider this. The experiment only demonstrates that intelligence can create some of the components of life. The experiment produced products that would have been toxic to life. The few biological chemicals that were formed had to be isolated from the watery environment, or none of them would have formed. So after a week, they found a red stain in the trap consisting of tar, a common product of organic reactions. Miller admitted that, quote, the amount of glycine and alanine was small for the amount of energy expended, unquote, 1.95% and 0.75%. And these products could not produce life in any sense. So, let's consider this. In effect, Miller and Urey discovered that random chemical reactions produce random chemicals. Yet the chemicals produced were also simple. A random collection of simple molecules is the opposite of what life requires. What is required is random chemical reactions that produce complex, organized, engineered chemicals of life. And there is no scientific reason to believe this could ever happen. So what's the fraud? The fraud is that for over 60 years, public school kids have been told in their biology texts and classrooms that the Miller-Urey experiment supports the idea that life can spontaneously sprout from the chance interaction of chemicals. This is not what the experiment proved. This is a lie perpetrated upon millions of students. So now we'll move to fraud number 3. This is called Bathybius Haeckelii. Here's the background on this one. Once Darwin's theory was accepted by the materialists of the 19th century, there developed a mad rush to find real evidence for the theory. Life from non-life, which is called abiogenesis, was one of the offshoots of this new evolutionary paradigm. Two of the well-known scientists involved in this search were Thomas Henry Huxley, who Milt spoke about last month, and Ernst Haeckel. Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Huxley, was especially keen on finding evidence for life from non-life. And on the left is Huxley, on the right is Haeckel. Here's how Huxley described this finding, this Bathybius Haeckelii, to Haeckel. So Huxley described it to Haeckel on October 6, 1868, and he described this Bathybius Haeckelii as the precursor to life. And this is his quote. A new moner, which lies at the bottom of the Atlantic to all appearances, and gives rise to some wonderful calcified bodies. I have christened it Bathybius Hecali, and I hope you will not be ashamed of your godchild. I will send you some of the mud with the paper, unquote. And so here's what happened. Haeckel examined the Bathybius samples and agreed that, with Huxley, that it was the original primordial slime, or earth slime, from which all other living things have arisen. And in 1874, Haeckel wrote a glowing article in Nature magazine entitled, quote, Scientific Worthies Thomas Henry Huxley, unquote, in which he praised Huxley for his contribution to Darwin's theory that had been published earlier in 1859. From the lowest to the highest organism, from Bathybius to man, Huxley, has elucidated the connecting law of development. So that's what Haeckel had to say about what Huxley had sent him. From this and other writings, we find that Haeckel and Huxley were thinking of evolution as a complete and unified theory, extending from protoplasm to mankind. Another way to say this, evolution can be described from this experiment and from other things we've learned as goo to you. So here we see, this is their idea. Once they found this Bathybius Hecali, they stuck it right here, and then they took all these other life forms, and they said, okay, this went into that, and that evolved into that, and then evolved, and so they've got the first start of life. This is what they thought they were able to prove. Now the truth is, by 1875, it was determined that Bathybius was just a chemical precipitate of calcium sulfate that was produced by the mixture of alcohol and seawater. The Bathybius was a reaction to the presence of alcohol in the mud used by the collectors to preserve the samples. Bathybius was and is just an inorganic chemical. It's not life. Here's another view of what they thought was life, but it wasn't life. It was inorganic. Here's the fraud. Huxley and especially Haeckel were slow to admit their mistake. Haeckel's popular book, The History of Creation, published in 1876, contained fictional drawings of Monera until the final edition in 1923. This is a drawing from Haeckel's book of the life cycle of a fictional Moneron named Protomia auranticia, and the conclusion A is that, quote, this episode certainly exposes Huxley and Haeckel to the charge that they were so driven by their own presuppositions that they were unable to conduct scientific research in a purely objective fashion. In other words, they were indeed misled by their own preconceptions about the truthfulness of a universal theory of evolution. That quote's from Andrew Sibley in the Journal Creation in April of 2009. Here's conclusion B. A study of the current state of evolutionary theory finds that even though evolutionists of today may be embarrassed to discuss the Bathybius story, they still believe all life must have come from non-life somehow in the past. Huxley and Haeckel were only following a logical trail of their science. Abiogenesis has not in any way been deleted from their foundational presuppositional structure. All of this, when there is good evidence that Huxley had good reason to know early on that Bathybius Hecali was a total figment of his imagination. So, the fraudulent part of this is that for many years after it was clear that they had that this was an inorganic substance, they continued to publish and promote the idea that they had found a continuous from the very beginning up through as far as you wanted to go, how life evolved. So now we're going to look at another of our frauds, and again, this was the same guy, Haeckel. So here's the background on Haeckel's embryos. So in this section, we learn more about Ernst Haeckel. He lived from 1834 to 1919. He was a marine biologist, medical doctor, and professor of zoology in Germany. He was also an accomplished artist and drew many living things in fine detail. But he's best known for this deception regarding the comparison of the embryos of life forms. Using his authority as a scientist and his artistic skill, he perpetrated one of the most famous frauds in the annals of science. Now, Haeckel, as we mentioned, he was a devout believer in Darwin's theory of evolution by modification and by natural selection. He stood firm in his belief to his death. And so the motivation here is this, maybe you've heard of this, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, and they called that the biogenetic law. Now, while Darwin, Huxley, and Haeckel did not originate the idea, they were all strong believers in the concept of the biogenetic law, and basically this is the idea that the development of the embryo of a life form duplicates the past evolution of the organism. So Haeckel developed some sketches of embryos that seemed to show this to be true, but it was not. His depictions were inaccurate in some cases and outright fraudulent in others. This is what Haeckel's sketches looked like. So what we've got from left to right, we've got fish, salamander, tortoise, chick, hog, rabbit, calf, human, going across this way. And he's trying to show that in the beginning that these embryos develop and they look like this as they develop. And as they develop in that direction, that matches the way that the animal had evolved. Now, if you look at these, what you'll find is that the tortoise, the third one in, the tortoise actually is pretty much accurate, but the rest of those are not accurate, and some of them are completely fraudulent. We'll go into that a little more detail. I'll show you here in a minute. So the result was that Darwin and Huxley were both very impressed by Haeckel's illustration and referred to them in their own writings. Haeckel's drawings were first published in his own books, first in 1868, then later in the 1897 book, Darwin and After Darwin by George Romanes. From this source, they were widely reproduced in English language biology texts for the next century, no doubt because his pictures appeared to provide clear evidence for macroevolution, unquote. And that's from Jerry Bergman's book. Actually, these illustrations are still depicted in some form or another in many biology books, and I'll explain that to you in a minute. Another result, the biogenetic law was resisted right away by some scientists, and it was formally disproven by the end of 1915. But Haeckel's drawings just looked too good for evolutionists to give up. Haeckel's drawings fraud was first exposed in 1868, and then again in 1874. Finally, in 1997, M.K. Richardson published some actual photos of embryos that showed how much Haeckel had modified the truth in his illustrations. So here we see Richardson's work. Many of you have probably seen this before. So this is what Haeckel had drawn as being how the embryos started out, and this is actually what they look like. And as I said, this is fairly accurate here, but the rest of these are not accurate at all. So you would think that they would give up on this, but no such luck. The illustrations are sometimes modified, but are still in 21st century high school and college biology textbooks and evolutionary textbooks. Here's some samples I've taken from current text. The only thing different about these is that this one shows this movement horizontally. The rest of these are vertical. But what I'm saying is that this has been disproven for over 100 years, and yet you're still going to find it in some texts because it just looks so good. Okay, so the ongoing fraud is, let's look at some ongoing fraud here. Here's a fairly recent quote. Quote, "The development of each child retraces the entire history of the human race, physically and spiritually, step by step. Babies start off in the womb as a single tiny cell, just the way the first living thing appeared in the ocean. Weeks later, as they lie in the amniotic fluid in the womb, they have gills like fish and tails like amphibians," unquote. That is Dr. Spock's Baby and Child Care, quoted in a 1998 edition. And this is totally untrue. Humans never have gills like fish or tails like amphibians. Dr. Spock continues in his book to say this: "Toward the end of the first year of life, when they learn to clamber to their feet, They're celebrating that period millions of years ago when our ancestors got up off all fours and learned to use their fingers with skill and delicacy, unquote. Again, this is fiction presented as fact, all based on the disproven biogenetic law and a bunch of evolutionary philosophical mumbo-jumbo. So ongoing fraud. While many evolutionists have stopped pushing the biogenetic law with Haeckel's embryos, they are still sympathetic toward Haeckel. For example, a man by the name of Robert John Richards in 1998 published a paper in Biology and Philosophy with the title, quote, Haeckel's embryos, fraud not proven, unquote. He believed that everybody, creationists and evolutionists, just were not fair to poor old Haeckel. Creationist E. van Niekerk did an extensive evaluation of R.J. Richards' work and did not believe that Richards had made his point. Here's what van Niekerk concluded. Quote, the photographs of Dr. Michael Richardson and others are as valid as when they were first published. R.J. Richards' attempts fall flat under closer investigation, and his scholarship is often extremely sloppy and does not represent the facts accurately. On investigating Haeckel's illustrations technically, it becomes clear just how many things Haeckel distorted in the embryo illustrations. His dishonesty can thus not be denied. And this was in the Journal of Creation, volume 25, 3, 89, pages 89 to 95 in 2011. So that was about 13 years after the guy came out to try to support that Haeckel actually had been unfairly criticized. So here's another look at Richardson's photos. This is the facts here. And as I mentioned, this shows tremendous distortion down here to what you actually see here is quite different from what Haeckel had put up here. Like I said, these look somewhat similar, don't they? But the rest of them, they're quite different. So number 5, this is one that Debbie's been waiting to hear. Debbie, the book manager back there. She told me this morning. So next we're going to look at the fossil record that should be filled with millions of transitional forms if evolution is true. Background. In 1859, Charles Darwin wrote, quote, but as by this theory innumerable transitional forms must have existed, why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth, unquote. And his answer was, quote, the noble science of geology loses glory from the extreme imperfections of the record. The crust of the earth with its embedded remains must not be looked at as well-filled museums, but as poor collections made at hazard and rare intervals, unquote. So Darwin blamed those geologists for not finding what he knew was there. So Darwin knew the fossils did not support his theory. He assumed the problem was because the geologists just had not found the transitional forms yet. So did Darwin put a pause in the promotion of his theory until these transitional fossils could be found? Without transitional fossils, there would be no way to scientifically support the idea of one kind of life slowly changing into another kind in the past. No macroevolution had ever been witnessed by anyone in real time either. So what did Darwin do? No, he did not pause the promotion, nor did any of the other promoters of his hypothesis pause. So we must realize how critical this lack of transitions is to Darwinism. It has been 165 years since the first edition of the Origin of Species publication, and the fossil situation has not improved one bit. Yet evolution continues to be considered by secularists to be the foundation of all biology. You heard me. Evolution still continues to be the foundation by secularists of all biology. So background. As evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould has so famously stated, we do not find and never have found anything other than stasis and abrupt appearance of fossil life forms in the rock record. And since 1859, the millions of additional fossils collected all around the earth show nothing significant that supports Darwin's idea that our collection of fossils from the fossil record is not complete enough to make a determination about the validity of evolution. Remember that theoretically there should be at least thousands upon thousands of these transitions in the record. Well, I know that some might say, well, that's just my unsubstantiated opinion. Well, let's see what PhD evolutionists have to say about transitional fossils. Here's an example of all fossils. Every one of these quotes now are going to be by evolutionists. Quote, we're looking at about all fossils. Individual kinds of fossils remain recognizably the same throughout the length of their occurrence in the fossil record, a fact that has been known to paleontologists long before Darwin published The Origin. That's Eldridge and Tattersall. Here's another example, all fossil. These are all evolutionists. Quote, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record is the trade secret of paleontology, unquote. A very famous quote from Stephen Gould. Example, invertebrate fossils. These are the forms of life without backbones. Quote, the fossil record for invertebrates tells us almost nothing about the evolutionary origin of phyla and classes. Intermediate forms are non-existent, unquote, Barnes. Example, vertebrate fossils, that's fossils with backbones. Quote, for the present at least, the environment of the first vertebrates, like the identity of their ancestors, remains unknown. Barbara Stahl, evolutionist, vertebrate history, problems in evolution. Example, another example of vertebrate fossils, quote, obviously major evolutionary events were occurring in vertebrate history during the Ordovician and Silurian, but we are still in almost complete ignorance regarding them. Alfred Romer. Example, amphibian fossils. Quote, although these finds carry the frog history far back into time, they do not tell us much of the frog evolutionary history, for even the primitive frog families differ only in relatively minor features from the more advanced ones, unquote. Romer again. How about fish fossils? Quote, the common ancestor of the bony fish groups is unknown, unquote. Romer again. Example, teeth fossils. Quote, while a flurry of work on the origin or origins of teeth is progressing, the details of when, where, why, and how teeth first appeared still elude consensus. Indeed, there is not even agreement on the fundamentals, such as how we define a tooth, unquote. Unger, Pete. Feathers. Quote, it is not difficult to imagine how feathers, once evolved, assumed additional functions, but how they arose initially, presumably from reptilian scales, defies analysis. Note that this evolutionist cannot even imagine how a feather could evolve from a scale. Neither can I. Birds. Quote, the evolutionary history of birds has long been an enigma. Ever since a single fossil feather was dug up 150 years ago, the origin of birds has been one of biology's most contentious issues. James O'Donoghue. A large number of specialists in bird fossils are primarily operating with a faith based upon the natural origin and evolution of birds from dinosaurs. That's where they're starting, is from the premise that birds have evolved from dinosaur and everything starts with that, even though there's no transitional fossils for such a thing. Here's an example, bats. The origin of bats have been a puzzle. Even the earliest bat fossils from about 50 million years ago have wings that closely resemble those of modern bats. Jeff Hecht and New Scientist. There are literally thousands of living fossils that defy the idea of evolution. If the life forms of today look much like those in the rock record, why would we think that they evolved from common ancestors? Here's whales. Quote, as with most tetrapods secondarily modified for aquatic living, ascertaining the terrestrial stock from which the whales came is exceedingly difficult. Perhaps the reason for this difficulty is that the idea is just a fantastic fairy tale perpetrated upon people to try to influence them to reject the Creator God. That's my quote. Conclusion. The idea of transitional fossils stays alive only because of the undying faith of evolutionists and is in truth a fraudulent idea. And I recommend the book, The Fossil Record, by creationist John Morris and Frank Sherwin. If you look at, they have got pages 129 through 177, fine print, listing all of the suggested transitional fossils that a gal, paleontologist at the University of Washington came up with, showing how each one fails, each one. So now I think I've given you the idea that there aren't any transitional fossils, folks. If there are no transitional fossils, then we aren't going to find any evidence of evolution, macroevolution in the rock record. So next, let's look at Archaeopteryx. Here's the background on Archaeopteryx. The primary accusers of Archaeopteryx as a fraud were Fred Hoyle and Chandra Wickramasinghe in their 1986 book, Archaeopteryx, the primordial bird, a case of fossil forgery. However, even though the notice of the first fossils came on the scene immediately after the first edition of Darwin's Origins book, neither he nor Thomas Huxley seemed very impressed with Archaeopteryx as their long-awaited transitional form. And Darwin and Huxley weren't the only ones skeptical about the fossil that had become an icon of evolution. So this is the idea that Hoyle and Ramesingh had, was that they saw the fact that even guys like Huxley and Darwin were not impressed by Archaeopteryx as being what it was being represented as something that was some sort of a transitional form. Here's more background. Quote, this is from Hoyle. He says, quote, "The trick was to invent fossils, basing them on genuine fossils acquired from the quarries, besides which it had for a long been found that higher prices could be obtained for something weird and wonderful than for something ordinary and straightforward, providing museum directors could be persuaded into accepting the weird and wonderful. To aid acceptance, skills in forgery had developed even as early as the 18th century, and indeed, the whole area had become notorious for its cooperatives of skilled forgers long before the appearance of Archaeopteryx in 1861, unquote. So that's Ramesingh and Hoyle's whole foundation for why they felt that Archaeopteryx was a fraud. And that's the environment, explaining here the environment into which Archaeopteryx burst forth, which was right after Darwin's book came out in 1859 as well. So here's the most famous specimen called the Berlin specimen. Many of you probably are quite aware with it. This is in almost every fossil book. That's a Berlin specimen of Archaeopteryx. There are currently, as of today, 11 specimens that have been found that people will agree that there are 11 specimens. The first was the feather. That was found in 1861. Remember, 1859, Darwin's first edition. The London specimen, 1861. The Berlin specimen, 1876. The Maxburg specimen, 1956. It's lost now. All they have is photographs and drawings of that. It's no longer in existence. The Haarlem specimen, 1855, it was very, very incomplete, very little, not much in the way of bones. The Eichstätt specimen found in 1951. The Solnhofen specimen, no one knows when it was found, where it was found, they don't know anything about it, but it exists. This thing always freezes up on me. The Munich specimen, found in 1992, very incomplete. The 8th specimen, just called the 8th specimen, found in 1990, very incomplete, and they already lost it. Found in 1990, it's lost, but they do have casts available. Then there's the 9th specimen, found in 2004, very little in the way of bones. And then there's the Thermopolis specimen, and that's the latest one they found. You can go to Wyoming and see that in the Thermopolis, Wyoming museum there. But no one knows when it was found, where it was found. They can tell you how much they spent to get it. Quite a bit. Okay, so not everyone agrees that Archaeopteryx is a fraud. What are the options? Well, let's look at the options. I think this is the best listing. It is a fossil transitional form between dinosaurs and birds. And don't let anyone tell you that that people don't believe this anymore. A lot of evolutionists believe this, that Archaeopteryx is a transitional form. Not all of them do, but a lot of them do. It is a fossil flying bird. That's another, what some people believe. It's a fossil dinosaur. It is a fossil dinosaur with fraudulent feather imprints. That's what Hoyle and Ramesingh believe. It's a fossil mosaic, like the platypus. God made this animal that looks like a dinosaur, but it's got some characteristics of a bird. That would be a fossil mosaic. All right, so it's important that you know that the feather specimen consists of a single feather seen in part and counterpart. So that means there was just one feather they found, and it was in between. It was in a Solnhofen limestone rock, and they split it apart, and one part looks like this, and the other part looks like that. So they're just reverse of each other. And you also need to know that that feather is 1/2 of an inch wide and 2.5 inches long. And you also need to know that it wasn't found anywhere near any Archaeopteryx fossil bones. But this is known as an Archaeopteryx feather. And it is the only feather that we have ever found. The feather. Okay, so I've been doing my own research on Archaeopteryx since 2009. I've developed information in the form of DVDs, books, and on my website. If you have my book, Fossils, Description and Interpretation Within a Biblical Worldview, I talk about that pages 107 to 122. I have a DVD on Archaeopteryx, What Was It? And that's also on my website, creationengineeringconcepts.org. Now here's my conclusions. Archaeopteryx was not a transitional form between dinosaurs and birds. Surprise! Archaeopteryx was not a flying bird. And I'm at odds with a number of creationists on that point. If the feather imprints are not real, then Archaeopteryx was a fraudulently modified dinosaur. Remember, those are imprints. They are not feathers that they're found in these fossils. They're feather imprints. If the feather imprints are real, then Archaeopteryx was a mosaic like the platypus. And so that's what I believe. I believe either if those imprints are correct, then it's a fraud. If they're real, and if they're not real, if they are real, then it was a mosaic. If they're not real, then it's a fraud. Okay, so that's where you can find out more about that. Okay, number 7. How many have heard about Nebraska Man? Not as many as I thought. Here's the background on Nebraska Man. This fraud is important because of its historical setting. In 1917, a geologist by the name of Harold Cook discovered a mammal molar tooth in Nebraska. He sent it to the head of paleontology at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, Henry Fairfield Osborn, who in 1922 announced that it was the missing link the evolutionists had been looking for in the evolution of man. Remember that the Scopes monkey trial was in 1925. At that event, Hesperopithecus, also known as Nebraska Man, was one of the great evidences that was touted in the attempt to sell evolution to Americans at the Scope trial. I've written about Nebraska Man in my books, The Creation Dialogues, Discovering the Animals of Ancient Oregon, and the Guidebook to North American Dinosaurs. But here's the guy behind the Nebraska Man, Henry Fairfield Osborn. He was born in 1857, died in 1935. There he is, the arrow's pointing at him when he's out in the field with Barnum Brown digging for dinosaurs, and the right hand shows a later picture. He was the head of paleontology at the American Museum of Natural History for 25 years and was a primary force for developing the museum's paleontology displays from nothing to being among the best in America. Actually, it matched up to the best in the world at the time. And here's some more about Henry Fairfield Osborn. He was a Darwinist, a racist, a eugenicist, and a tyrant. He was on the cover of Time magazine in 1928. He had an ego that was as big as the state of Nebraska. And he was called arrogant, bigoted tyrant by his associates. He was quoted as saying of himself that he was a great man. And here's what Osborn announced in his paper in Science magazine on May 5th, 1922. Hesperopithecus, the first anthropoid primate found in America. We have been eagerly anticipating some discovery of this kind, but we're not prepared for such convincing evidence of the close faunal relationship between Eastern Asia and Western North America as revealed by this diminutive specimen, unquote. Whatever it is certainly a contemporary fossil of the upper Snake Creek horizon, and it agrees far more closely with the anthropoid human molar than that of any other mammal known. He says there, far more closely with the anthropoid human molar than any other mammal. Don't forget that. And as a result of Osborne's announcement, this artistic rendition appeared in the June 24, 1922 edition of the Illustrated London News, with an article below hyping that fossil evidence of ape man had finally been found in America, and the paper was calling him Nebraska Man. So the paper is what came up with the idea of calling this guy Nebraska Man. This is all fictional art here, cartoons. The earliest man tracked by a tooth, an astounding discovery of human remains in Pliocene strata. And then here's the big story about it down here, and telling how great all this was. So here's the other thing about Osborne, as you know, in 1925, during that Scopes trial, a guy by the name of Williams Jennings Bryan tried to present the creationist side of the argument against the evolutionists. And he was a Christian, but he wouldn't stick to the idea of a six-day creation. He allowed for greater periods of time. Of course, that sort of put him at a disadvantage in his arguments. But what you find here is that Osborne was making fun of William Jennings Bryan. He ridiculed him for sticking to the Bible. Here's what Osborne said. He said, "I advised Mr. Bryan to drop all his books, as well as his attempts to grasp the meaning of the diversity of opinion among scientific writers, and to inquire of the earth only what it had to teach him. I added that he would not necessarily lose his religion, but that he would certainly become an evolutionist." And of course, what he wants to do is he's talking about Job 12:8, which reads, "Speak to the earth, and it shall teach thee." And so he's trying to say, I know more about the Bible than you do, and what you got to do is you got to believe that in evolution. Well, here's the article in Nature, the drawings, and what we want to look at here is that, for one thing, he didn't even do things in order. So 6, 2, 3, 4, 5 instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So these are the Hesperopithecus. This one is under a certain light. This is under another light. Those are identical. The one tooth that Cook found, and these others are. Number 6 is the third superior molar of Anthropithecus, a young chimpanzee. So this is a chimpanzee, and then 2 is a young chimpanzee. 3 is a adult ape man that they think they found. 5 is a North American Indian. This is a North American Indian. So this is the evidence that was presented in this article that made a big deal about the fact that he found a precursor of man, an ape man. Okay, so soon numerous new teeth were discovered. So all this came out based on one tooth. In the same area, they found more teeth, and not only were they identical, but they were in much better shape. And so although in 1927 Science Writer served as the formal obituary for Nebraska Man, Anthropithecus was cited in textbooks as valid until at least 1945. So in 1927, they found the other teeth and found that they're actually what they are is Prothinopteris, a peccary, or New World pig. But from 1927 to 1945, Anthropithecus was cited in textbooks as valid as a Nebraska man until 1945. And here's a picture of a peccary. And I think most of you know what a human looks like. How do the evolutionists explain this screw-up? Well, in a 2002 book by Prothero and others, Horns, Tusks, and Flippers, The Evolution of Hoofed Mammals, the authors blame the possibility that anyone would ever express doubt in evolutionary pronouncements on the religious fervor of Christian fundamentalists, and they wrote this. In case you're wondering what a Christian fundamentalist is, I'm one. Okay, so here's what they said, quote, "How were Osborne and Smith so easily fooled? First of all, it was a very easy mistake to make. As we have already seen, both primate and pig teeth look very similar because they are square, bunodont teeth adapted for omnivorous diets. Most people would not be able to tell them apart. In addition, the specimen was highly worn and abraded, so any characteristic of peccaries had been lost. So here's how one fundamentalist Christian responded to Prothero's excuses. This is what I wrote in my book. I said, quote, "I would say it would be more accurate to assign the blame for these types of mistakes to the evolutionist belief in the false presupposition of the naturalistic worldview. I would also point out that if the misidentification through the analysis of teeth is such a very easy mistake to make, then perhaps evolutionists should not be so quick to use teeth alone to describe and name vertebrates from the fossil teeth they find in the rock record," unquote. So let's move now to fraud number 8, the horse series. Here's a background on this. Is another iconic evolutionary image in the horse series. Background: it's probably true that more words have been written about horse fossils than any other category of mammal fossils. Most of this is because of O.C. Marsh's famous 1876 depiction of linear Darwinian evolution beginning with Orohippus and ending with today's Equus. So in the next slide, we will see the genealogy of the horse, prepared by Marsh in conjunction with Thomas Huxley's lecture in 1876. So here we see it. This is what Huxley was able to sell. I mean, he was a great salesman, as Bill tells about how good Huxley was telling his stories. So we got Orohippus down here with multiple toes, and then they show how the teeth evolved up to and all this, the evolution is this direction. Orohippus to Mesohippus to Myohippus to Protohippus to Pleohippus to Equus. And this drove the idea of how horses came about for decades upon decades. Huxley and Marsh believed that the horse series indicated that the straight line evolution seen in the chart was true. So Prothero, again, who I just quoted about the teeth, said, "So the linear picture of horse evolution became deeply entrenched in the textbooks for over a century, long after many more fossil horse specimens had made it obsolete. Indeed, it is still being reprinted in historical geology books. So most evolutionists now believe that the series is incorrect, but the horse series is still found in museum and textbook diagrams. If you had gone to the Oregon Museum of Natural History in Eugene just 5 years ago, you would have seen this display, and this shows Marsh's genealogy of the horse regarding his feet. And it says up there, it says, looking back from the modern horse, scientists can tell that over the past 55 million years, horses' feet changed from having many toes to only one. And I took that picture myself, and I was standing there, and that, I'm telling you that this is gone now, but this is very recent that they took that away. So the horse series is slowly being replaced, and the idea is, but evolution has not lost. We have not lost evolution. This is Simpson's from 1951, and you'll still see this because this is so wonderful. You start with Hyracotherium down here, and see, notice the arrows. The arrows are going, the arrows are up there. And this is today's horse, the Equus. And it's interesting though that even though you've got these arrows, you've got these question marks put in here. And but what I'm saying is that what you're going to find now, this is what they like better. This matches up better. It's bushier, so they can show a lot more things that went extinct and so forth. Here we start and we go in this direction, and this is what you'll find in a lot of museums now as a current depiction of horse evolution. The horse series, as Huxley promoted, is out, but evolution from one kind to another kind is still strongly promoted. So where's the fraud? The fraud is that what is found as fossils in the rock record is variation within kind and extinction, but macroevolution of one kind to another is not what is promoted. In this book, I've spent all of chapter 14 on the study of the origin of horses, and here are my main conclusions. Because of their reliance on atheistic presuppositional evolutionists, evolutionists led the world to an incorrect interpretation of horse fossils that lasted for over a century. There is no evidence-based reason to believe secular paleontologists have scientifically disproved the biblical statement indicating that the animals we call horses were created by God on day 6, and these animals have become varied only within their created kinds. In addition, it's my conclusion that all the genus names seen in evolutionary charts and diagrams regarding these horse fossils found in Oregon can be reduced to a maximum of just 2 created kinds. Next, we're going to look at what I would describe as the most influential fraud of all time. It is not only iconic, but also ubiquitous throughout Western culture. Images like this have caused the youth of today to come to the conclusion that ape-to-man evidence is enough to convince them that evolution is fact. Here's a cover of a 200-page book from 1970, the contents of which have influenced millions upon millions to believe that the evolution of man from an ape-like creature is scientific fact. This is one of the first illustrations in the early man book, and down here in the yellow, I'm going to read what it says down there. I'll put it up here bigger so you can see it. It said, quote, "The ancestry of man, traced by naturalist Ernst Haeckel in 1867, remember him, was one of the first attempts to deal with the specifics of evolution." We're talking about 1970 now. Although the genealogical chart, starting with a blob of protoplasm and continuing to a modern Papuan, is filled with misconceptions and fictitious creatures, it is fairly accurate, considering the dearth of knowledge in his day. So in 1970, they're saying that it's all wrong, but it's still pretty good, right? And so at the same time, here's another progression that shows, this is what they like to show. They show, here we got, starting with nothing in these fish, they're starting with a fish in this diagram. Fish, amphibian, mammals, monkeys, and man evolving, finally come out here. And this is why the World War II generation, this is why the World War II generation believed in evolution of man from apes. And now we're going to see why our current generation believes in it. This is the progression of early man. This is the whole page showing the whole progression that is in that early man book. Here's another example, a current example. This is from 1979. Here's what creationist Marvin Lubenow had to say about the early man depiction. He said, "The parade has been one of the most successful tools ever used to promote human evolution. It constituted powerful visual proof for human evolution that even a small child could grasp. It was a masterpiece of Madison Avenue promotion. There were few social studies classrooms and school library bulletin boards where this parade was not prominently displayed. Because of its graphic power, it is still indelibly etched into the minds of billions of people worldwide. Even the writer of the book, Early Man, stated that the figures in the progression were built up from a few fragments, a jaw, some teeth. They were products of educated guessing. But did anyone read that? Why would you read that when you have a picture that shows what really it meant? Now, I want you to notice something here. Are these apes moving along the ground in the way apes normally move? No, they're walking. They're walking. They're all walking. The early man author stated, although proto-apes and apes were quadrupedal, all are shown here standing for purposes of comparison. Lubenow responded with the words outrageous, outrageous, and I am amazed. And then he wrote, first, these 15 forms were not standing, they were walking across the pages from left to right. Some of them have 1 foot in the air as they walk. Second, if a first grade child were asked to compare an ape or chimpanzee with a modern human, the most obvious comparison for the child would be that apes and chimpanzees walk on all fours and humans walk on 2 legs. Are evolutionists that ignorant? Of course not. This is raw propaganda, brilliant propaganda, but raw. Lubenow closed the paragraph with the words, quote, yet no evolutionist protested this gross lack of scientific objectivity. Here's a cover of the November 1985 issue of National Geographic. Nat Geo is a consistent and enthusiastic promoter of deep time, evolution, and anything Darwinian. So they have advanced. By the time of 1985, they've got smoother picture, cooler pictures and color. I'll show them color in a minute. This is a progression in Nat Geo's from Australopithecus afarensis to modern man. Notice that the bodies are almost identical except for the amount of hair. However, the heads are shown to have changed greatly. This is total fiction, not at all supported by science. Here is the artistic rendering in full color from Nat Geo. These two guys, Australopithecus afarensis and Australopithecus africanus, were apes. They were knuckle walkers and could never have run like depicted in this series. Same thing for the two guys to the left in the middle panel. Homo habilis is a jumble of Homo and Australopithecus bones. He never existed. Homo erectus was a fully human individual who suffered from various pathologies. If his maladies were serious enough, he probably could not run either. These three guys were all regular humans. Any of them could have either had a lot or a little hair. They could all run, and some of them could run better than others, depending on their training and the specifics of how their bodies were constructed, which depended largely on individual genetics. You might find this quote by the late Dr. Whitcomb helpful. Quote, "While the physical differences between man and primate are quite great, the spiritual, linguistic, cultural differences are little short of infinite," unquote. Perhaps this is the best explanation of all. I've been studying the specific subject for 2 decades, and now I'm going to share with you how the Christian can understand the ape-to-man fossil evidence. Don't look at these things, these drawings that they put out there, but just consider the following, how the Christian can understand. Here are the way I found helpful. There are 2 ways to consider. What you're either seeing there are 2 categories. Category 1 is post-flood and post-Babel morphological variable humans. The bones are either that or they're this. Unknown or extinct apes from the same time period. That's all the things that you're seeing. That and combinations of that. So what we have here, I think the proper conclusion to the progression of ape to man depictions is they're nothing but illusions in the minds of evolutionists and a fairy tale fraud perpetrated to influence people to reject God's word and the creator of the evolution, creator of the universe. Now, it is an illusion, but it has been fantastically successful, especially in our schools. I know when I was in school, every science classroom, every history classroom had that pasted on the wall. And it was throughout the whole Western world that was up, and that's why it's the greatest fraud of all times. Okay, we're kind of come to a break here in just a minute, but I want you to take a look at our book table in the back there where Bonnie is. Those books will give you more specific information about some of the things I've talked about. This is a coloring book for the kids, and we have a 11 by 17 poster for the different kinds of dinosaurs back there. And we got fossils. I always like to explain to people that fossils are educationally and fun. You should start your own museum. And most fossils are evidences from and proof of the Genesis global flood at the time of Noah. Every fossil we have out there is a result of Noah's flood. There are some fossils that are not, but everything we show you there, so that as a Christian, biblical Christians are the ones that should be collecting and teaching about fossils, not atheists and other evolutionists. We have a reasonable explanation for them, the worldwide flood, that the paradigm does not have. They haven't got any explanation that makes any sense. Also, if you want to sign up for the CEC News, that comes out once a month by email on the first Tuesday. Articles and research and products of particular interest to biblical creationists. And so sign up if you aren't getting it. It's free. And guess what? It is now break time. And I'll come back and finish this up after the break.
Great. Thank you very much, J.D.
All right. The last half of my talk is going to be shorter because we got through 9 out of 14. and so we don't have as many to go through now. We should have time at the end to have questions and answers. Now, most people have heard of the Piltdown Man. How many people have heard of Piltdown Man? Yeah, a lot more people. What is Piltdown? Well, Piltdown is a town. There's where it's located in England, in the county of Sussex. And that's where Piltdown Man was discovered, or I guess it would be more accurate to say fabricated. I want you to remember 3 19th century men with the first name Charles. These are important men from the 18th century. Charles Lyell, Charles Darwin, and Charles Dawson. Okay, I'm sure you're familiar with Lyell and Darwin, but who was Charles Dawson? Well, he was a lawyer. He was a prodigious hobbyist in fossils, antiquities, and historical artifacts. He was a great hoaxer and fraudster, and he was the discoverer of Piltdown Man. So what was Piltdown Man? Here's a summary. Eoanthropus dawsoni, or Piltdown Man, was for over 40 years considered by the experts of the day to be proof of a race of pre-humans. In 1953, it was finally determined to be just a fraud consisting of a human skull and the jaw of an ape. For those 40 years and many years after, it was taught as fact in textbooks and throughout the world, and had great impact on the belief by the average person that man had indeed evolved from apes. Once it was determined that it was a hoax, there were so many men involved in its initial promotion that it was a big mystery as to which man or men had perpetrated the hoax, although most experts today believe that the main culprit was Charles Dawson. This is the 1922 reconstruction of Piltdown Man by Emmy Routeau, based only on the skull and jaw discovered by Dawson in 1912, along with the usual infinite imagination of the artist. When the remains of Piltdown Man were presented to the Geological Society on December 18, 1912, the press reaction was ecstatic. They said, quote, "Remarkable find in Sussex," unquote, Manchester Guardian. And the London Times said, "First evidence of a new human type." New York Times, "Paleolithic skull is a missing link." And they also said, "Far older than cavemen." All of these men, some others have been accused of being the conspirator or the co-conspirator for the Piltdown Man hoax. So this is a pretty long list. Charles Dawson, he was a fossil hunter, a hoaxer, and a discoverer. I already talked about him. Arthur Smith Woodward, geologist, and he takes the credit for being the co-discoverer. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, Jesuits priest. Venus Hargraves, excavator and workman. Arthur Conan Doyle, the writer. Arthur Keast, an anatomist. William Butterfield, a museum curator. Martin Hinton, a zoologist. William Solas, a paleontologist. Samuel Woodhead, a chemist. So all those people were involved in this hoax. And here's what we got going. This is a mandible of an orangutan, and what they broke an orangutan jaw, and then they abraded the molars and modified it, and then they added it to a regular human skull. This is a plaster cast of the Piltdown Man that was constructed in 1912. The dark areas represent original bone. This is original bone, and the rest of it was all put together by whoever did it. The white areas have been recreated. In this photo, entitled "Searching for Piltdown Man," Charles Dawson is standing with a hammer, and Arthur Smith Woodward is seated with a sieve at the gravel pit in Piltdown. We can't leave this picture without noticing. Anybody have an idea who the arrow is pointing at there? That's Charles Darwin. He's overseeing this painting by John Cook. That's an artistic interpretation of a meeting held in August 11th, 1913 at the Royal College of Surgeons. The artist succeeded in transmitting to the viewer that there was an undeniable unity by all science in the interpretation of the Piltdown man's skull. In the image of Charles Darwin, even the image of Charles Darwin in the background seems to be looking down with approval. So that is the first arrow is Charles Dawson, and the third guy. So this is Dawson. That's Dawson, and that's Woodward there. And then these are other approving scientists and surgeons and so forth that are saying, yeah. And so laying on the table is Piltdown Man. On July 22nd, 1938, a lasting tribute to Dawson and his Eoanthropus dawsoni, a stone monolith, was made from carboniferous sandstone, and it was erected at Piltdown, close to where the skull fragments had been found, supposedly. Both Woodward and Sir Arthur Keith made speeches, and here's the wording that was inscribed on the monolith. Quote, "Here in the old river gravel, Mr. Charles Dawson, FSA, found the fossil skull of Piltdown Man, 1912-1913. The discovery was discovered by Mr. Charles Dawson and Sir Arthur Smith Woodward in the quarterly, was described by Dawson and Smith in the Quarterly Journal of the Geological Society, 1913-15. Literally thousands of articles, papers, and books were written between 1912 and 1953 promoting the authenticity of the findings of Piltdown. You got that right. From 1912 to 1953, thousands of articles written about the authenticity. And hundreds of articles and books have been written since 1953 highlighting the shortcomings. So the conclusion is that the Piltdown Man hoax illustrates the fact that people tend to readily believe anything that matches their presuppositions, no matter what the evidence really shows. It also illustrates that some people will go to great lengths to attain fame and fortune. Here's a quote from a guy who wrote this in 1959. He said, quote, "That the gentlemen who launched the Piltdown Man were possessed by the preconceived idea that a missing link possessing his features would one day be found will become abundantly clear when we observe their pattern of behavior," unquote. So that's Piltdown Man. Now we're going to move to the peppered moth. How many have heard of the peppered moth? A lot of people have heard of the peppered moth. Here's the background. In 1953, H.B.D. or Bernard Kettlewell performed some experiments on peppered moths that for decades were hailed as Darwin's missing evidence, evolution's prize horse, evolution in action, and more. Even today, some Darwinists hold that they are proof of natural selection in action. Kettlewell's peppered moths are still mentioned in most school textbooks as examples of evolution, even though many evolutionary scientists have written that they were highly flawed, perhaps fraudulently performed experiments. So, there's no evolution. Kettlewell's experiments in no way proved evolution of one kind of organism into another kind of organism, even though evolutionists often will say that microevolution or variation within a kind can be extrapolated to macroevolution. There is no scientific evidence that supports this idea. At the beginning of Kettlewell's work, he had peppered moths, and at the end, he had only peppered moths. Any changes observed were only in the varieties or the population of varieties of the peppered moths. Whether natural selection was in evidence depends on what you believe about natural selection, and I'll be talking about natural selection as a 14th myth or fraud. Here we see a typical peppered moth, the lighter variety, and it's called Biston betularia typica. And the moths and the butterflies are similar. Some of you probably know more about this than I do, but what we got here is this is the big grouping, and within that grouping are butterflies in this order, and moths in this order. But we're only we're only talking about moths today, the peppered moth. There's also, that's a lighter, and they also have a darker variety, and it's called F. carbonaria, and it differs due to having more melanin in it, just like in humans. We talk about the fact that human skin, how dark human skin is, depends on how much melanin is in the skin. Well, that's also true with these moths. Here's the story. So, in Manchester, England, in the mid-18th century, there was lots of pollution going on because of burning coal as the Industrial Revolution got rolling. And supposedly, a population of peppered moths shifted from coloring from mostly white to mostly black after soot darkened their tree trunk homes. Then bird predators had a difficult time seeing the now camouflaged dark moths, so those moths began to thrive. So here's the whole premise for all this experimentation that Kettlewell did. We got tree trunks, and the tree trunks used to be mostly light, but there was so much soot in the air that the tree trunks became dark. So that's the premise that they're starting with. Now, Bernard Kettlewell was a medical doctor, husband to his wife, father to 2 children, the life of the party, and an admitted fanatic about moths. He is known worldwide for the famous peppered moth experiments. He set out to prove Darwin's theory in the early 1950s with the moth. He became known as a great naturalist, but not so great scientist. And all those spots on him, those are moths. He was called the Mothman. He loved moths, and he lived with them even. So what was Bernard's experiment? Here it was. Kettlewell designed his experiments and modified them as he went on. He spent the time in the lab and days upon days in the field, mostly by himself. He gathered the experimental data. He interpreted the data. He announced the results of the experiments. And so we shouldn't be so surprised to find out that the announced results matched his goal. And there was, in science, if you're going to determine if something is true, you want to be able to have the ability to prove that it's false. Well, there was no blind work done by Kettlewell that would ever have indicated that to him. So here we have evolution action photos taken under Kettlewell's direction at Oxford in England. So in this picture what we have is we have a dark covered bark, and here's a live light peppered moth, and here's the dark one. And here's another photo, evolution in action photos. That's what these are called, evolution in action. This is a lichen-covered bark. These are alive but artificially posed moths. There's the dark one, and there's the light one. So here we have them on light bark. Here we see the light one, there's the dark one. Now these moths are dead, and we know they're dead because their spread wings are showing out and they're pinned on there. And then here we find on soot-covered bark, sometimes these are pretty hard to see, aren't they? So there was little pushback, the influence of the peppered moth experiments, there was little pushback on the results reported by Kettlewell and his academic sponsors at Oxford for about 15 years. Then the objections began storming in. Dr. Ted Sargent from the University of Massachusetts, another moth expert, wrote in 1969, among other things, he wrote, quote, "You can tell by looking at the moths that they are fake. These moths are not in resting attitude. When they rest, they pull the antennae back under the forewings, and their wings are back in a triangular shale, not spread out." The way Kettlewell had laid out the moths was not natural, and he had basically trained birds to flock to the bird feeders he had designed and gobble up the moths. And what we have to understand is that moths rest on the underside of leaves and branches. They don't rest on the tree trunks anyway. And there were other problems too with this, which are told in this book called An Evolutionary Tale of Moths and Men, The Untold Story of Science and the Peppered Moth by Judith Hooper. If you want to know all the details about this man and his experiments, you should get this book. It's got all of the details in it. What you need to understand is that Judith Hooper is an evolutionist too. And so, as is often the case when somebody doesn't have a direct, aren't directly involved in something, they tell the truth. So all these problems that are in this book, skillfully documented. The book was out in 2002. Anyway, even before the book was published, the pressure on Kettlewell became unbearable. His hard lifestyle, his daughter committed suicide. He had all kinds of problems with his health, and he had all this criticism coming at him from every direction. This all brought him to a position of deep depression, and he committed suicide on May 11th, 1979, at the age of 72. Well, that is too bad. That is a tragedy. But what an even bigger tragedy is that his work still lives on in current high school biology textbooks, as seen here. They use his photographs still yet today and his descriptions yet today. And here it says up here, the peppered moth, natural selection in action. And of course, what they do is they explain that natural selection is evolution. So by using these pictures and so forth, and these explanations that Kettlewell came up with, our kids are still being told that peppered moth proves natural selection. Natural selection is evolution. So the conclusion, current genetic science indicates that this is onset of a melanic trait. This onset of a melanic trait in peppered moths is likely the result of a complicated process of gene shuffling during moth development internal to the moths, not due to Darwin's external mechanism of natural selection. You want to remember more and more often what creation scientists are finding and what the evolutionists can't dispute is that the changes, the variations in kinds that take place are internal. They're things that are internal. They're not external. And that's the case with these moths. In general, it might be best to conclude that the peppered moth lesson is that living creatures are engineered to adapt by their creator. And to most evolutionary scientists, natural selection is real. Since natural selection is all they have, whatever can be imagined as natural selection will be on faith, quote, unquote, evolution in action. So now we're going to move to Archaeoraptor, number 12. Here's the background on Archaeoraptor. Most secular dinosaur paleontologists teach either that dinosaurs evolved into birds or that birds are dinosaurs. Since the evidence is lacking for either of these scenarios, there is an ongoing search for various missing links that might make the stories believable. According to the Bible, birds were created on day 5 and dinosaurs were created on day 6. So creationists have no fear that someday the proof will come to be to show that secularists believe on what the secularists believe. Archaeoraptor leoningensis Sloan is a name given to one of these missing links that unsurprisingly was proven to be a fraud. The Archaeoraptor is another blunder that resulted from deeply held presuppositions of deep time and macroevolution. So here's the timeline. 1997, a farmer fossil hunter in northeastern China, a Chinese man, finds fossil remains and reconstructs them to be better saleable to Western paleontologists. This is very similar to what went on in England right after Darwin's book and prior to Archaeopteryx. Then June 1998, a Chinese dealer buys the fossil from the farmer. February 1999, an unnamed fossil is sold to a Stephen A. Circus at a fossil show in Tucson, Arizona for $80,000. November 1999, the fossil named Archaeoraptor is touted in National Geographic magazine as a missing link between dinosaurs and birds. October 2000, National Geographic prints a retraction. The story is called Archaeopteryx was a fraud. This fraud was a comedy of errors also brought about by misguided secrecy, misplaced confidence, clashing egos, wishful thinking, manipulation, stubbornness, outright lying, corruption, and poor communication. So here are the National Geographic images. This is the cover of the book. And this is the big picture of flying dinosaur question. It's a missing link between terrestrial dinosaurs and birds that could actually fly. Now, it's a well-known fact that even though it's a crime, punishable up to execution, to export fossils from China, many fossils are indeed exported each year. Most of them are fakes. If the fossil is valuable enough to make it to America, that means they got to get a lot of money for it, because they got to run through a lot of hoops, or else they'll get arrested, or even worse. Now, the people involved in Archaeoraptor fraud also knew this and just allowed their search for a missing link to overwhelm their good judgment. This is a National Geographic photo of Archaeoraptor that was shown in the November 1999 Nat Geo, and it's a mismatch. It's the bones constructed from a bird and a dinosaur by the Chinese farmer. The left side is mostly dinosaur parts, so over here we got mostly dinosaur parts, and over here we got mostly bird parts. And the size of this fossil is about a foot square, just to give you an idea. So, who are the cast of characters in the Archaeoraptor? Stephen and Sylvia Xerxes, directors of the Blanding Dinosaur Museum in Blanding, Utah. Bill Allen, editor of the National Geographic magazine at the time. M. Dale Slade, benefactor of the Blanding Dinosaur Museum, who provided the $80,000 for the fossil. Philip J. Curry, paleontologist at the Royal Tyree Museum of Paleontology in Alberta, Canada. Christopher P. Sloan, art editor for National Geographic. Zhu Xing, director of Beijing Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology. And it continues. Kathy B. Maher, senior editorial researcher for National Geographic. Professor Timothy Rowe, high-resolution X-ray facility at the University of Texas. Kevin Allenbach, fossil technician at Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology in Alberta. Henry Gege, senior editor of Nature magazine. All of these people had a hand in allowing for Archaeoraptor fraud to be perpetrated in National Geographic in November 1999. But the largest blame must be laid on Stephen Xerxes and his wife. So who was Stephen Xerxes? Well, he was a dinosaur modeler. He was great at that. He was great at making these models for movies and everything. If you go to his museum, you'll find a lot of his models there. You also find he has a complete, huge section of his museum of movies. The advertisements for movies for dinosaurs. You got the greatest collection of it in the world, I think. So he's also director of the Blanding Museum there, amateur paleontologist, the true believer in dinosaur to bird evolution, and he's the primary impetus between Archaeoraptor. Now, Xerxes was the last of those involved to come to the realization of the truth regarding Archaeoraptor when he admitted he and his wife had made an idiot, bonehead mistake. So, here's a sad story. Xerxes passed away in 2015 at the age of 63 from cancer, but to his dying day, he never changed his commitment from a belief that one day fossil evidence would prove that birds have evolved from dinosaurs. This commitment is clear in the existing displays in the Blanding Dinosaur Museum and the several papers he had published on the topic. The museum still strongly promotes the idea based on the unswerving faith in the concept. And one common thread is that believers can see feathers that others cannot see in various fossils. If you're a believer in dinosaur evolving into birds, everywhere you look, you see this evolution taking place. Now, while God certainly could have created dinosaurs as feathers, there's little or no evidence of that so far. For example, here's a photo I took of one of the panels at the Blanding Dinosaur Museum last time I was there, and it proposes how flying bird feathers evolved from a proto-feather. So he's got an imaginary proto-feather, and then it has more of these legs to it in stage 2 and 3, and then all of a sudden it blossoms out into looks like more a body feather for a bird, and now it's getting closer and closer to a flying bird feather. Flying bird feathers have all kinds of things that have to be just right for them to work. The barbs, the barbules, it has to have the rachis has to be off center. Many of you are probably familiar with all how detailed and complex a bird feather is. Well, right here, now I'm going to read what he says here. He says, a hypothetical reconstruction of the different stages of development in the evolution of a feather can be made by continually simplifying the structure of a modern feather. So he said, if we go backwards, we can see how evolution went the other way. The most advanced feather is a flight feather that has a hollow root called the calamus, which extends into a long rachis or shaft, complete with asymmetrical veins made of barbs, barbules, and hooklets. Stage 2 is what we now know existed on pterosaurs. Oh, do we? The simple structure of the protofeathers consisted of only branched barbs extending from the calamus. This means that feathers either evolved independently in different stages or birds and pterosaurs share a distant common ancestor. So this hypothetical story is based on imagination, really. There's no evidence that any such thing ever happened or could happen. Evolutionists continue to come up with such stories so that they can reject the Creator God and believe that they are in charge, not God. So now we're getting close here, 13 out of 14. This is the Himalayan fossil fraud. This is the work of one individual, and the main character is Vishwajit Gupta. He's got a PhD from Punjab University in Chandigarh, India. He was born in November in 1942. The other character is John A. Talent, PhD at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. Bill Berry, PhD, University of California, Berkeley. Gilbert Clapper, PhD, University of Iowa. Philippe Janvier, PhD, Natural History Museum, Paris, France. So who is Vishwajit Gupta? Well, here's who he is. Boy genius, born in 1942. Full professor at age 22 at Punjab University, Indian science hero. Wrote or co-wrote as many as 450 science papers over 25 years. His work was shown to be substantially fraudulent in 1989 and 1990, and he retired in 2002 at the age of 60. Now, Gupta's work, first shown to be fraudulent by John Talent from Australia, once that came out, many other scientists noted that Gupta's work represented multiple acts of fraud and scientific misconduct. Gupta began his fraudulent career in 1964 when he published 2 papers in the prestigious journal Nature, co-authored with his supervisor, Professor Sani. The papers reported the finding of fossil graptolites in India and were later found to have been taken out of Sani's collection of Burmese fossils. Gupta's PhD was also based on a mixture of fossils from unidentifiable localities and photographs plagiarized from monographs on the fossils by one F.R.C. Reed. In 1967, he stole fossils from a university in Wales, where he had been working in the geology department, and he published that he had found the fossils in India. In 1980, Gupta went to China, where he was shown a large collection of fossil fish. In July of the same year, he visited Paris and showed a specimen of a fish to French paleontologist Philippe Janvier, claiming that the fish came from the Himalayan region. Gupta insisted that they should co-write a paper immediately before Gupta returned to India. 5 papers were written on the fish. It was determined that Gupta had stolen the fish from the China institution, and all the papers were frauds. The specimen had been smuggled out of China for the sole purpose of committing scientific fraud. Gupta evidently continued to base his career on fraud until 1989, when Professor Talent brought them to international attention throughout the paleontological community. Gupta denied wrongdoing, and Talent says that Gupta threatened to kill him. In 1992, Punjab University instigated an inquiry into Gupta's academic work. The final report was handed down in April 1994 and found Gupta guilty on all charges: plagiarism, recycling fossils, inventing fictitious localities and discoveries, and misleading and duping his many co-authors. The paleontological world called for Gupta to be stripped of his PhD and DSA degrees, both of which had been demonstrated to be based upon fraudulent work. Makes sense, right? Strangely, that is not what happened, and Gupta was allowed to keep his position within the university with only some restrictions on his influence. People may ask, how could someone considered to be such a star in the Indian scientific community get away with this? How could this happen? Now, Gupta was able to identify the requirements for the Paleontological Club. He had accepted the main club requirements of believing evolution on millions of years. That's how you get into the club, folks. If you want to be in the Paleontological Club, those are the two requirements, and the only requirements, really. He learned that it was hard work to do original research and that there was no one checking his work. Others in the club were too busy to pay any attention to Gupta's work, and once he gained some fame, no one dreamed he was a fraud until John Talent noticed some unbelievable claims in Gupta's work. There was nothing too unusual about this case except for the inclination by Gupta to lie, cheat, and steal, and maybe even murder. Only God knows how many others have done similar things in order to advance their scientific career. Conclusion. So if Gupta lived as an atheist, it could be said that he was only acting according to his worldview. If all humans are simply the result of the random acts of matter over deep time, and there's no higher authority than in the individual, what would be wrong with any person with that viewpoint, stealing, lying, and cheating? Okay, next we're going to look at what I consider to be evolution's greatest fraud. And before we do that, I want to remind you what the definition of fraud is. Deceit, trickery, intentional deception. So I want to prove in my case that Darwin's natural selection is a fraud. What is natural selection? Here's a modern definition from a high school biology textbook. Quote, evolution is inherited change in the characteristics of organisms over time. Living things are slowly changing and have apparently been changing since they first appeared on Earth. Charles Darwin proposed that this change is the result of natural selection. In natural selection, these organisms with favorable versions of genes are more likely to survive and reproduce. So according to this, life has changed over time, and so this is called natural selection, which is insinuated to be the same as evolution. That's what they teach the kids, and that's what all the evolutionists believe, that if natural selection is true, even if you tack some mutations on with it, well, then that's evolution. So what is the fraud? Natural selection is presented by evolution as scientifically true, but is basically an historical statement. That is, that organisms have changed over time. And so natural selection cannot be understood to be a statement about science or a basis for the existence of evolution. There's nothing about natural selection that explains how or why organisms may have changed over time. What is the fraud? Nature cannot be a selector since it has no ability to select anything. Nature or environment or climate just exist, and organisms adapt to them or not. Darwin came up with the idea of natural selection because he thought he could see nature selecting in the same way that he bred his pigeons. This never happens, and every scientist knows it never happens. Because of Darwin's disposition against design, he had to come up with an external mechanism for animal and plant adaptation, but the external mechanism he envisions cannot do what he hoped they could. Most evolutionists know that Darwin's natural selection does not work. That is why the idea of mutations being the main driver of evolution was added to Darwin's idea. But scientific research has shown that beneficial mutations are exceedingly rare, and near-neutral and deleterious mutations are far more common. So what's it matter? Because natural selection is so often presented as an undeniable and foundational biological fact, the average educated person believes it to be scientifically proven. They have not been given the opportunity to see that is more accurately a historical or metaphorical presupposition rather than science. Thus, most people who think natural selection is true, therefore also think evolution is true. What about creationists? Well, numerous creationists also say natural selection is real. For example, quote, natural selection is really a very straightforward, common sense idea. Creatures with features, traits suited to survival in a given environment tend to survive better than those that do not have those features, unquote. This is the same position of evolutionists, isn't it? And it has the same objections. So let's look at this Second paragraph. Quote, although nature, this is continuing the same creationist quote, although nature is not a sentient being and therefore cannot do any selecting, natural selection is a convenient phrase to use when discussing the survival or death of individuals, unquote. Yes, it's very convenient if you want to confuse everybody. So I think this is double talk. They agree that nature cannot select, but they still want to keep natural selection. No wonder so many accept evolution as fact. Maybe natural selection is just a metaphor, and that would clear everything up for everybody. Maybe it's just a metaphor. Maybe we can live with that. Well, so what is a metaphor? A figure of speech in which a word or phrase literally denoting one kind of object or idea is used in place of another to suggest an analogy between them, as in, the ship plows the sea. That's from Webster's New Collegiate Dictionary. So if we accept that natural selection is a metaphor, then how do we understand the metaphor? What is the analogy we are to understand? Next, let's listen to some evolutionist ideas about this. So we're going to listen to some evolutionists, what they think about this. Here's a metaphor. First, this is Mayer. He said, quote, in evolutionary discussion, it is often stated that selection pressure resulted in the success or elimination of certain characteristics. Evolutionists here have used terminology from the physical sciences. What is meant, of course, is simply that a consistent lack of success of certain phenotypes and their elimination from the population result in the observed changes in a population. It must be remembered that the use of words like force or pressure is strictly metaphorical, and there is no force or pressure connected with selection, unquote. So would it be correct to say that there's no external force or pressure, and therefore the phenotypical changes are simply the result of something internal? If so, nature would be doing nothing except existing. No selecting or thinking, or let alone acting or forcing. Here's another evolutionist. Quote, evolutionary biologists routinely speak of natural selection as if it were an agent. And many evolutionary biologists, in fact, assure us that the idea of selecting agent is only a metaphor, even as they themselves succumb to the compelling force of the metaphor. And so we are to believe that natural selection, which is not an agent except metaphorically, manages to design artifacts, unquote. Numerous scientific papers by evolutionary scientists have expressed similar thoughts about natural selection. It seems that evolutionary and creationist scientists are not sure what natural selection is, but they want you to know it's real. It seems to me that natural selection is dead. It's a dead fraud, and it would be good if creationists would acknowledge the fact. Now, Herbert Spencer coined the term survival of the fittest to be a synonym for natural selection, and Darwin even accepted the nomenclature. So it says survival of the fittest. A close study of biology shows that traits which are the biggest, fastest, or strongest do not always increase the ability to produce viable offspring. So even calling it survival of the fittest really isn't what's happening. When you look at some of these things, what is happening is survival of the luckiest. That's my observation, is that if you've got a bunch of leopards, a bunch of antelope or whatever they are, the one that gets is the one that happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, as much as it is the culling thing. That's what these may have been prime animals that these animals got. They might have been the top of the line. They just were unlucky. Okay, so here's a photo of Charles Darwin's I Think notebook, where he first sketched that he thought that life form variety is a result of natural selection over long periods of time, and also calls survival of the fittest. Darwin thought that this progression could be seen as being similar to a tree trunk and its branches, with all the life coming from an ancient common ancestor. As a result of his conclusions, he wrote the famous book, The Origin of Species. And from that, today, we get hundreds of these, what we call these evolutionary life charts, tree of life. And these are, I'll bet you if I've seen 100, I've seen 1,000 of them. And they're all based on evolutionist idea, Darwin's idea, and the fact of natural selection causing all this change. Well, what we know is that that's totally untrue. Remember all the talk I had to say about transitional fossils? Well, there's no proof of this happening in the rock record, and we're not seeing it happen. Have any of you seen one kind of animal change into another kind of animal? Have you ever seen any record of that ever happening? Have you ever seen one kind of a plant change into another kind? No, you haven't. You see variation within kind. You see adaptation to environment of a kind, but you don't see one kind change into another kind. So this is my idea of I think, how I would have written an I think if I was going to do an I think. And you've probably seen it before when I've spoken. And it means that what we're talking about here is that we're looking at a forest or an orchard. It's not one tree. There are lots of places where things started out as a kind and then changed over time. Okay, again, it decides to freeze up on me. So now I want to talk about Darwin again. Natural selection. Is it Darwin's fault? Some would like to diminish Darwin's responsibility for the acceptance of evolution in Western culture. After all, he was encouraged to write his origin book by others, and he didn't understand the complexity of life. Nor did he really push natural selection later in his life. But he's the one who is revered today by academia and media. No other 19th century naturalist is venerated like he is. But Darwin knew what the Bible says about origins, and he wanted to find an alternative. He rejected Christ. Darwin wrote and published Origins, and no one else did. Darwin chose to accept Lyell's for presupposed uniformitarian theory. Darwin chose to accept the faulty Malthusian population ideas. Darwin knew that his tests for the validity of natural selection all resulted in failing marks. Therefore, I think we should continue to hold him responsible for most of the damage to truth his theory has caused over the last 165 years. I do not think he should be let off the hook. He's best described as a tormented deist, not an atheist, but not a Christian either. In 1880, he wrote, quote, "I am sorry to inform you that I do not believe in the Bible as a divine revelation, and therefore not in Jesus Christ as the Son of God." Best evidence is that Darwin never had any deathbed conversion either. If you doubt these statements, send me an email and I'll give you some information that speaks against the deathbed statement of accepting Christ. I repeat, he's the one who is revered today by academia and media. No other 19th century naturalist is venerated, and I think he deserves most of the blame for natural selection and, as a result, evolution that's accepted in our schools. So, conclusion A. All around us we see creatures that are perfectly suited to thrive in their environments, such as hummingbirds collecting nectar with specially shaped beaks, and cavefish adapted for life in the dark. Creatures are fitted with what they need, like some octopuses that rapidly adjust key proteins to maintain the speed of signals transmitted through their nerves in either warm tropical or frigid polar water. These features reveal the power, wisdom, and care of their Creator, the Lord Jesus. As Romans 1:20 states, God's attributes are clearly seen in everything He has made. And that comes from the Institute for Creation Science. ICR is doing great research based on their hypothesis that organisms change due to an internal engineering process that they call continuous environmental tracking. ICR is working under the premise that the words natural selection can be totally removed from the study of the science of biology. Independent researcher Phil Gaskell, who spoke here not too long ago, has also evaluated experiments that indicate life adapts through engineered optimization. Conclusion B. Fraud is especially a problem in attempts to support Darwinism, and especially in this field, it tends to take decades to root out the fraud. Hundreds of well-documented cases of fraud have been discussed in the literature. Unfortunately, except for replication, which is uncommon in many fields, fraud in science often is very difficult to detect. Usually it is a lab assistants and colleagues who uncover fraud, and they're often unwilling to report it because doing so can cost them friends, tarnish their reputation, and result in retaliation. That's from Jerry Bergman. The bottom line is that evolutionists have to work hard to prove evolution because of the lack of evidence for it. Creationists do have the great advantage in science because they know that biological evidence cannot go against God's Word. As the extreme complexity of the design of life becomes clearer, the idea of an external cause for adaptation in organisms is becoming totally absurd. What about replication? Well, here's a summary statement of a 2016 article in the Journal of Nature. The idea that scientific research is commonly supported by replication is a myth. It is really seldom accomplished. More than 70% of researchers have tried and failed to reproduce other scientists' experiments, and more than half have failed to reproduce their own experiments. So, objective science, the idea that scientists are generally objective and always following where the evidence leads, is another myth. Quote, there are material incentives to fudge research. Pumping out papers can yield jobs, grants, speaking engagements, and seats on corporate advisory boards. This pushes researchers to chase unique and interesting findings, sometimes at the expense of truth. On everything from evolution to abortion, pandemics to climate change, gender to gay adoptions, the science is settled line is frequently invoked, and people actually believe it. So that's what we're up against. We must not forget what God's Word has to say on the topics of natural selection and science in general. God created according to kinds. 10 times in Genesis 1 it says that. John 1 through 3, he said, in the beginning God was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Nothing was made that has been made. Nothing was made that has been made. That's Colossians, Hebrews. My brothers and sisters, can a fig tree bear olives or a grapevine bear figs? So all of these allow for variation in kind and extinction, but it excludes the evolution and a progression of life through natural selection. Science, logic, and God's Word are in accord regarding the fraud perpetrated by the acceptance of natural selection. But God gives it a body as He has determined, and to each kind of seed He gives its own body. Not all flesh is the same. People have one kind of flesh, animals have another, birds have another, and fish another. I would like to provide you with this quote as a way that Christians, without technical training, can understand and explain variation within kinds without resorting to natural selection. If you think this is too complicated for you, just remember this. God specifically designed the created kinds with genes in the DNA that could be turned on to help them adapt to new environments. In other words, the Creator continues to accomplish His purpose for organisms after creation, not by creating something new, but by working through existing parts that were designed during creation week, unquote. That's Don O'Daniel in the Galapagos Islands, a different view. Perhaps it could even be said that God designed the genes of DNA to be modified forward and backward, in some cases very quickly. That's what Yasko was trying to tell us. Okay, now if as a creationist you're still having trouble letting go of your long-held attachment to natural selection, please consider this one final argument. Where did the philosophy of naturalism come from that you have had no problem with rejecting? Did it come from God? No. It came from the anti-God thinking of men. That's where naturalism came from. Most creationists can say, I don't believe in naturalism. But in the same way, Darwin's natural selection came to the mind of an avowed anti-Christian. Creationists logically should totally reject this idea too, that attempts to credit life form adaptation to the non-intelligent entity we call nature. And that's it. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you very much.